Okay, here we go. This is 2017 CPT for digestive. Make sure I got this going right. Again, you've got your table of contents. Great picture here to kind of tell you from the beginning of the GI system all the way down. Great place to put notes if you have some notes. The digestive system, just like several of the other systems, start at the top of the system. So like respiratory started with the nose and then flowed down. Digestive will start with the lips and the mouth and then flow down from there. Not a heck of a lot of notes to put in here. Stuff's pretty self-explanatory. Again, if you find your body system and then find your body part, then look at the action. Are they incising? Are they excising? Are they repairing? Remember, your suffix for repairs is plasty, so that will kind of help you. So here are excisions, repair codes. Now we're into the mouth, different procedures specific to the mouth. We turn to the tongue and the floor of mouth. So know that the vestibule of mouth is more just the opening of it, whereas your tongue and floor of mouth is a little bit more specific. I do want you to make a note, codes 41120 to 41155, you would not use a 50 modifier on these. No 50 modifier. We get into the dentoalveolar, palate uvula. I do have a note on code 42200 that this is a cleft lip with palate repair, cleft lip with palate, hard palate, okay? We get into the salivary glands and the ducts. So this is where our spit comes from. Then we get into the pharynx, which is the throat. Adenoids and tonsils are, adenoids are behind the nose, tonsils are behind the, straight in the back of the throat. If you're my age, you probably don't have your tonsils anymore. Chances are you don't. So there's incision of tonsils, pharynx, throat, adenoids, excision. Again, you need to have a note 42820 to 42836. 42820 to 42836 is no 50, no bilateral. We get into the, on other procedures over here, just make a note, you may need to use modifier 78. Remember our cheat, we can go to the front. Modifier 78 is an unplanned return. Then we get into our esophagus, incision, excision. We're beginning to get in an area here that has a lot of indented codes. And then within those indented codes are tons of parentheses. So really, really be careful as you're going through here. This is probably a good place, and I probably should already have some underlines in here, and I don't, but I'll show you what I'm talking about. Here's the endoscopy section under your esophagus. So your esophagoscopies, not your EGDs, but only scopes for the esophagus will be right here. And any of these endoscopies will include dilation if it's done, so make yourself a note. So this is what I'm talking about underlining. When we look at 43180, this is a rigid endoscopy with diverticulectomy. So there's this single endoscopy, esophagoscopy right here is very specific to a specific problem. So 43190 starts our diagnostic. And then if you see every code underneath for 43191, yeah, I said that right, is indented. All of these are indented. So really make sure that you your eyes see the indentions. And this is what I mean by a whole lot of parentheses. Underneath every single one of these is just a whole lot of parentheses. These parentheses will be vital if you're looking at using one of these codes. They're going to be vital to accurate code usage. Again, these are still all indented for very specific reasons. That whole section is your esophagoscopies. Then we start our EGD. This is probably the more common. Difference between an esophagoscopy and an EGD. Esophagoscopy is only going as far as the esophagus. An EGD is going to the G, which is gastric or stomach, and going to the D, which is the small intestines, the duodenum or duodenum, however you say it. So these EGDs go all the way to the first part of the small intestine. So it's through the esophagus, through the stomach, through all of those sphincters, and then into the small intestines. Now, like we talked about in our bronchoscopies, you can stack these. If they're doing a couple of things while they're in there doing the scope, then you can stack them. You have to account for everything that they did. So if they take out biopsies by 2 different methods, then you find the codes in here and you can stack them. And I just kind of have myself a little reminder here that the EGDs continue. This is just like what we've seen, lots of parentheses, indented codes. Anytime I encounter or find a code in here, I go and underline, like 43239. I have been here before because it's underlined with biopsy. So that just helps me the next time. That must have been pretty common thing for me to be looking for. So next time I'll know exactly where to come. I generally, or used to, I don't as much anymore now, but I used to, every time I encountered a code, I would make some kind of note about it, especially if I had trouble finding it. Okay, so really listen to that. If I have trouble finding a code and I finally get there and I know it's correct, then I sit and I make notes to help me not to have to search forever again. So if I had come to this particular section and had really had to search for stuff and I went someplace else and then finally came here, I would make notes at that someplace else to come here, because chances are you'll go to the same place again in error. Code 43246 is a PEG tube. This is a placement for a percutaneous gastrostomy tube. Very, very common. It's a feeding tube straight into the stomach. Okay, moving on. These are still the EGDs. Then they stop and we start our ERCP. It's an endoscopic retrograde cholangiopancreatography. Crazy, crazy. But that's what the ERCP stands for. Such a long name, we call them ERCPs. Retrograde means against the flow. So anytime you see the word retrograde, if the flow is normally down, then the retrograde means they're going against that flow. They're going up something, going against the flow of blood, against the flow of urine, against the flow of digestion, whatever it is. If you see antegrade, A-N-T-E grade, that means they're going with the flow. So that particular procedure, test, radiology, whatever it is, would be going with the flow of blood, with the flow of urine, with the flow of food or gastric juices or whatever it is that they're looking at. So that's the difference between those two words. So all of this area in here is your ERCPs. If you have gallbladder or pancreatic, if they suspect those kinds of problems, you're probably going to have one of those. Then we get into laparoscopy. So all of these procedures in here, now remember, we're still under the esophagus. I think we're still under the esophagus. So if we go completely backwards, see, we're still under that body part. So this is pretty upper GI. We are not into colons or anything like that. This is still very, very upper GI. Fundoplasties are in here. This is your approach. So if something is done laparoscopically, they're putting in trocars, they're insufflating the abdomen, which I just heard on Grey's Anatomy last night when I was finally catching up with stuff. I thought, gosh, I want everybody to listen to this because these are the words that we're learning, and it's kind of fun to hear them on TV. Anyway, so when they do something laparoscopically, they're using scopes. So there's cameras, there's words like insufflation, words like trocars, words like ports, that kind of thing. These are not open procedures. Then we have repair. So this is different repair of the esophagus. You'll see plasty as our suffix in here because that's repairs. Again, all of this is repairs. Then we have a manipulation section. So say a person had a narrowing of the esophagus. So the doctor goes in just to manipulate the esophagus and make it bigger in that area. So dilation of esophagus could be one of the codes that are found in here. These do not include the endoscopic or endoscopy part. So these manipulations are done without scopes. Okay, so make yourself a note. So if you're looking for a manipulation or a dilation of the esophagus with a scope, you need to go backwards to the endoscopy section. Now we're into a different body part. Here's our stomach. So we started at the lips, mouth, esophagus. Now we're into the stomach. Incision, excision, laparoscopy. Under introduction, code 43752, this is a naso or orogastric tube placement. This is a tube that goes from the nose to the stomach or from the mouth to the stomach. Most of the time, I've dropped, I don't know, hundreds of these in my career as a nurse. Most of the time, the nursing staff does this. So make a note here that if you are claiming 43752, it's because it required a physician's skill. The physician had to do it to get credit for it. If the nurse did it, there's no billing for it. I have a note here, and we'll see that code in just a minute, but I must have encountered this in, I don't know, something that I was working on. An NJ tube. And NG is gastric, so naso to stomach, nose to stomach. This is naso, nose to jejunum. So this is that part of the small intestines. So this tube is going much, an NJ tube is going much further into, or it's a longer tube going down into, through the stomach into the small intestines. I just put that there because at some point I must have had trouble finding it. So then I make myself a note. We'll see that in just a minute. Okay, again, we're still on stomach. So here's our bariatric surgery. This is when they're stapling. I remember back in the 70s, you would get your stomach stapled. That was the big words. So, or that was the name of it. So this is laparoscopic bariatric surgery. Other procedures, remember they're a catch-all. All kinds of bariatric stuff in here. Sewing up stomachs, shows you pictures of different procedures for morbid obesity. Then we're getting into intestines. Does not include the rectum. So this is just intestines. Intestines can be small intestines or large intestines. This is intero. So this is intestinal, like this first code, 44005, enterolysis. Lysis means a setting free, so there must be some adhesions in the intestines. Entero means intestines. Usually is talking about the small intestines. Duodenectomy. So this is cutting, otomy means incision, so this is cutting into the small intestines. Colotomy. This is otomy, cutting into the colon. Okay, so excision, part of the intestines, if some of the intestines have to be removed. Pretty good pictures in here, kind of getting an idea of when stuff is removed. A lot of times you'll see wording like anastomosis. That means, so if we're looking at this picture here, this blue part is part of the colon that's being removed. So then they would take this part and sew them together. So here's the intestines. The center part's being removed, and then they put the two ends together and sew them back together. That's called an anastomosis. So you guys may remember that from medical terminology. I don't know. Do kind of take note, 44139, this is just a little bit of a lingo thing. If you see in the operative report or in the scenario that they, well, sorry about that, that they have, the lingo may be mobilization, that they mobilize something, that's a taking down. So I just kind of bring that to your, because that's very, very common to see and to read. Laparoscopic approach here. So all of this approach, these excisions would be considered open. So they've directly opened up the abdomen and are directly looking at it. Laparoscopic, again, we'll use scopes, ports, interostomy. So these are, ostomy is an artificial creation of a hole where there wasn't one. Here's some endoscopy procedures. So this is on the small intestines. Endoscopy stomal. This is endoscopies through a stoma. So the patient has an ileostomy, has a colostomy. They already have an ostomy. And so I go in and I underline the codes that have stoma so I don't get here and pull this code when I shouldn't. So 44380 is a stoma, through a stoma. Everything's indented underneath. Again, 44388 is a stoma. Everything's indented, you see? So it just kind of helps my eyes know what I'm looking at so I don't get as confused. Here's that 44500 in J tube I told you we'd see. It's a super long tube. Different repair codes. Just a few codes for Meckel's diverticulum in the mesentery. And then we're into appendix. There's only a few codes for appendix. You can either do an open excision here or a laparoscopic incision, or excision, sorry. Then we're into colon and rectum. This would be your large intestines. There's no small intestines in here. Colon is strictly large in this area. Okay, so on page 300, endoscopy. Now we're going to start kind of some of the colonoscopies, proctosigmoidoscopies, sigmoidoscopies, all of those. Make a note, you always code to the furthest extent. And I'll talk about that in just a second, but make a note here and then I'll explain what that means. Here are different definitions of the extent of each of these scopes. Your stoma scope, we know, are backwards. We've already seen those. So these in this section will be your proctosigmoidoscopy, your sigmoidoscopy, and your colonoscopy. So I go through and I underline where these start. So my eyes, if I'm looking for a proctosigmoidoscopy, I start right here. If I'm looking for a sigmoidoscopy, I start over here. This is a little bit of a decision tree. They've kind of added this. It may be helpful to you, potentially. We're going to talk about extend in just a minute. Code 45378 starts our colonoscopies. You do, yeah, starts our colonoscopies. Let's look at the colon here. So a lot of times, so here's the rectum. This S shape is the sigmoid, S for sigmoid. Then once you get out of the sigmoid, starts the actual colon. Some different anatomical landmarks to kind of know the extent. The splenic flexure is this corner. The hepatic flexure is this corner. And remember, we're looking at this like we're looking into the patient. So they call this corner a splenic flexure because the spleen is sitting right back behind there. You can actually palpate the spleen right there. Underneath your ribs, you should feel maybe two fingers of it if you palpate it. Then over here, sitting right behind here, is the liver. However it's drawn. The terrible drawing. But that's why this is called the hepatic flexure. Flexure means corner, turn, whatever. So this is splenic flexure and hepatic flexure. And then when you get all the way down here, this is where the appendix is. You see this small tube right here. This is going into the small intestines. And then the small intestines are all sitting up in here. So if you see documentation that they went to the cecum, or they saw the ileocecal valve, there is a valve right here that closes off, so you can't get a backwash. This is the ileum, the terminal ileum, which is the very bottom of the small intestines. There's a valve here, and then the cecum starts. And think about it, all of the waste product is coming from the small, it comes from our mouth into our esophagus, into our stomach, into our small intestines, and then into our large intestines, and then out our anus. So anytime there's a valve or a sphincter, it's keeping backflow. You don't want small intestines bile coming back into your stomach. We've all kind of been sick before and maybe even had some dry heaves with some green bile. It's terrible. That's when you're getting that backflow. So this ileocecal valve is just kind of a landmark that tells you how far they've actually come. So let's come back from all of maybe useless information to you. I don't know. So when we're coding the furthest extent, let's say that on our scenario we're reading, the doctor says he's going to do a sigmoidoscopy. That means he would come in here, go through the S, and stop. Sigmoid is only to the sigmoid. But let's say we do have documentation about the sigmoidoscopy, but let's say that we saw that the doctor went all the way to the hepatic flexure, which is over here in the corner. Well, we are not going to code the sigmoidoscopy. We're going to code instead a colonoscopy because we code to the furthest extent. And that's what that means. It doesn't matter if the doc put, maybe the doctor put, he's performing a colonoscopy and only got through the sigmoid, and then maybe there was a tumor or a growth, or I don't know, maybe they weren't cleaned out well from the Go Lightly, whatever it is. He meant to do a colonoscopy but didn't, only did the sigmoidoscopy. So then in that you would do the reverse, only code the sigmoidoscopy because that's as far as they got. So that's what I mean by code to the furthest extent. Pretty much all your scope procedures like this, your lungs, your intestines, all of them, you code to the furthest extent. Sinus surgeries, you code to the furthest extent. Okay, so a couple of things to make note of. Again, any of these scopes, your bronchoscopies, your esophagoscopies, your esophagogastroduodenoscopies, which are your EGDs, and your sigmoidoscopies, proctosigmoidoscopies, colonoscopy, all of them. You can stack them if there's multiple things done at that session. Code 45380, this is a biopsy. I have the word cold here because that could be the lingo that you see with this, because if you look down here at 45384, you have hot biopsy forceps. So you do have the ability to have cold and hot. If both of these were done in the same colonoscopy, you would stack them and code both of them. All right. A few things down here that I've underlined just because I've encountered these and kind of had a little bit of trouble with them. Code 45391 is an endoscopic ultrasound, limited, of the rectum, sigmoid, and descending. Your 45392 is an ultrasound endoscopic ultrasound intramural. So I put ultrasound or US by these so they come to my attention. Like I said, for me, if I don't notate something the first time I've had trouble with it, I will have trouble with it every single time. I'm just not going to be able to remember, oh yeah, that's what happened. There's too much. You can't remember. Okay, so moving into the anus, different body section. I know we're thrilled about this. That is hemorrhoids. Isn't that fun? You have your incision codes, your excision codes, introduction codes, which are a catch-all. There's just two. Your endoscopic. So here they use a different word, anoscopy. So this is actually an anus scope. It's an anoscopy. So if you see that, it's not a typo or something weird, you know that the scope is just going just barely into the anus and the rectum area. Repair anaplasties. Remember, plasty is the suffix for repair. Now that's the end to here is the end of the actual GI structures. Now we start with what we call the assisting or the accessory digestive organs. Accessory is a good word. So here's the liver. The reason they're accessories because they provide juices, enzymes, bile that assists in digesting food or assists in pulling out the nutrients. So here's the liver. You have liver transplant benchmarks. Much like the lung and the heart, you all have these benchmarks. All of those procedures have them. I do want to point out these excisions are open, whereas you do have the laparoscopic approach choice. Remember, approach is very, very important. You have to know how it's being approached in order to find the right code. Next accessory organ is the biliary tract. It includes the gallbladder. The gallbladder sits on the bottom part or the back side of the liver. It has a biliary tree that gets stuff from the liver and then goes over and gets stuff from the pancreas, and all kind of comes together and then dumps into the small intestines. So this would include all of that biliary tree or biliary tract, as well as the gallbladder. So you'll see a lot of like looking at 47490 chole, C-H-O-L-E. If you see that, you're probably dealing with gallbladder or something about the gallbladder. Different stuff. Lots of people have gallbladder issues. I have no idea why I have a red spot there. That's just publisher dotting me. Endoscopy procedures, laparoscopic procedures. Since there's a laparoscopic area, that's the approach. Remember, anything else would be an open approach. Here's your excisions. Whoops. So there were laparoscopic approach, and then there's excisional approach, open. Then we go into a pancreas. They can do pancreatic transplants. So this is the same kind of thinking with the lungs, with the heart. Then we're a little bit broader body area, but this is your abdomen, peritoneum, and omentum. Omentum is that muscle that kind of lays over the abdomen. Peritoneum is around just all of the structures and mucous membranes around the abdomen. It holds all the organs within the peritoneum. How you see peritoneum quite a bit is, say your appendix ruptured. And with that rupture came peritonitis, itis meaning inflammation. So your appendix ruptured and it blew all of that infection or fecal material, whatever was in the appendix that slowly grew and made it burst, threw all of that into the abdomen, not into organs, but into the cavity of the abdomen, and that's the peritoneum. Very, very serious infection if you get peritonitis. Okay, so these excisions would be open. Laparoscopic is that approach. This just kind of flows. We do have code, and I'm on page 320 now, code 49440, 49440. This is an insertion of a gastrostomy tube. That's that PEG tube. Gastrostomy tube. And then there's different conversions. Sometimes the gastrostomy tube needs to go into the jejunum, and so they have to convert it into that. So read your conversion and read your parentheses here. Okay, one of the last sections of the digestive system is for hernias. These are hernia repairs. I have a note up here. I do have to, on some hernias, like an inguinal hernia, those are groin hernias. They're on the left side or the right side. So I do potentially need to keep up with my right and lefts. This particular repair section is your open section. It's not laparoscopic. These are all open. There's 4 pieces of information that you need to know in order to get the right codes in here, and I probably should reorder these, put them in a different order. Approach probably should be number 1 because that would get you to open, but I have age as number 1. They're divided by age. Number 2 is your approach, whether it's open or laparoscopic. 3 is your type of hernia, so is it an inguinal hernia? Is it a ventral hernia? Is it an incisional hernia? Is it a femoral hernia? What kind of hernia is it? And then what is the behavior? And what I mean for behavior is, if you look down at some of these, I'm going to turn the page. It may be a little... Okay, so let's look at code 49560. 49560. This is repair of an initial incisional or ventral hernia. That just told you incisional hernias and ventral hernias could be the same thing or could be different. Incisional could probably be anywhere on the body. Generally, they're on the abdomen. Ventral hernias are abdominal. They're on the front of the trunk. So here, a behavior is reducible. That means the hernia that is maybe around your belly button is reducible. It's popped out, you can push it back, and then it stays in place. That is a reducible hernia. Then you have on code 49561 incarcerated or strangulated. These are about the same thing. That means when the hernia pops out, it gets stuck there. How I remember it, incarcerated, if I go to jail, I'm stuck there until somebody pulls me out. Strangulated, same kind of thing. It's the same thought process. So if it's reducible, you can push it back into place. If it's incarcerated, the hernia gets popped out, and then it gets tangled or gets stuck between muscles or something, and then it's stuck out there, usually causing pain, causing some kind of little deformed bubble or lump, and so that's incarcerated. So that's what I mean by behavior. Here, starting with 49650 is your laparoscopic hernias. So remember, this first section is an open approach. The second section is a laparoscopic approach. I do go in and underline what kind of hernia it is. It just helps me. These first few hernias are very, very, very specific to newborns. Most everything has a 5-year and under or 5-year and older. Let's look at code 49568. 49568. This is a mesh that is used for an open incisional or ventral hernia, or mesh for the closure of a necrotizing soft tissue infection. So you're going to see hernias that have mesh implanted. You cannot code for that mesh implantation unless it's an incisional hernia, a ventral hernia, or a necrotizing soft tissue hernia debridement. Okay, so make note of that, because on the board they're going to try to trick you and have you use this incorrectly. All right, that is it for digestive. We're going straight into urinary. This is all part of your chapter 14. Again, here is your table of contents. Great picture here to write notes on. Again, the urinary system, like many other systems in CPT, are starting at the top of the system. So for the urinary system, we don't have that many parts. We've got 2 kidneys, 2 ureters, 1 bladder, 1 urethra. If you're female, your urethra is about 2 inches. If you're male, it could be 4, 5, 6 inches. Okay, so starting with the kidney, you have incision. There aren't too many notes on here. Again, this is when you read your scenario, you find your organ system, and then you find your body part. Once you find your body part, then you look at the action done on that body part. So if your scenario is talking about cutting into a kidney, this could be where you're at. If they talk about cutting into your kidney and excising something, then you may be over here. Renal transplants, same kind of benchmarks as all the others. I do a little underlining here, because 50300 is a cadaver donor, 50320 is a living donor. We've got 50323, which is a preparation of a cadaver. 50325 is preparation of a living donor. So I just like underlining that, then it pops out at me if this is the area that I'm looking for something. We have introduction section. Remember, that's your catch-all with your other procedure section. Those are kind of the catch-all, kind of hard sections. This is specific to renal pelvis catheter procedures. Renal pelvis. Lots of injection type of codes in here, because there's a whole lot of different radiological procedures that are done on the kidneys. A lot of them have contrast or dyes involved, and this is where you would get your dye codes, your contrast codes. Also any aspiration codes, injection codes, they're all in here. Then you have your repair codes. These would be open. Laparoscopic repairs would be a laparoscopic approach, closed, but laparoscopic. Nephrectomy, this is removal. Ectomies are removal, so these are kidneys being removed. These are different endoscopic procedures, diagnosing. Most of the time, sometimes they're actually doing something, but a lot of times they're kind of diagnosing to then see what to do. Your lithotripsy, this is using the sound waves to break up renal calculus or kidney stones. Now we're into the ureter, so we're out of kidneys. There's 2 kidneys right and left, so that you have to use your LTs and RTs. Ureters, there's 2 ureters, so you're going to use your LTs and RTs. Again, here is your kidneys. Now we're into ureters, the long tubes. Kind of straightforward through here. Be very, very careful in this section, because you have ureter and then you have your urethra down here. Urethra looks a lot like ureter, but it has an H in it. So really critically read to make sure you're not getting your ureters and your urethras mixed up on the codes. And I'll show you in a minute the sections of those. I did want to, and maybe this will be an okay, right here is the bladder. You see where the left ureter and the right ureter, left and right, either one of them come in. There's an opening in the mucosal lining of the bladder. So there's where the urine is dumping. Urine is produced up here. The kidneys pull out the blood, filter the blood, pull it out, and then the byproduct is the urine. Adds urochrome to it, which makes it yellow or straw color, dumps into the ureters, and then dumps into the bladder. From the bladder, it then dumps into the urethra, which is the hole right here. This area, the triangle area, is called the trigon area. A little bit of trivia, but it might help you on some of the scenarios that we may read. If they're talking about trigon area, different inflammations in it, this is the area that they're talking about. Okay, moving on. Again, these are different approaches, laparoscopic approaches. This is endoscopy directly toward the ureters, not urethra, but the ureters. Then we get into our bladder, incision of the bladder, excision of the bladder, or different tumors that may be in it, whatever. These are open. We have an introduction section. And I do want you to look at codes 51701 and 51702. These two are bladder catheter codes. One is a straight catheter, where they would put in a catheter, drain the urine, and then pull the catheter out. 51702 is a Foley catheter that's indwelling. They would put it in, and then it stays there for a day, a week, or whatever. You can only code these if they're done independently and by the physician. Most of the time, these are performed by the nurses. Anybody who's a nurse has done this a million jillion times. So these can only be claimed by the doctor if the physician actually did it and documented that he did it. Okay, urodynamics, this area, kind of checking what your urine flow is. Do you have some type of slowing of your urine flow? Do you have a decrease of production of your urine flow? Do you have too much urine flow and it gets back to, you know, whatever the issue is, this is different voiding studies. Repair codes here, again, these are open repair codes, then a laparoscopic repair. Then we get into the endoscopic area. This is very, 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 very common area if you have urinary problems, whether you're male or female. Very, very, very common area. If you see, every code in here starts with cystourethroscopy. Cystourethroscopy. So cysto meaning bladder, urethro meaning urethra. So this is going from your urethra all the way into your bladder. Every code includes that cystourethroscopy, every single one of them. So let's say that we have a bladder tumor that's going to be removed and it's 3 centimeters big. So here, code 52235, it's kind of getting, sorry, it's a little shaded. 52235, cystourethroscopy with fulguration, including blah, 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 and or resection. Resection means excision of, and then semicolon, medium bladder tumor, 2.0 to 5.0. So I had said it was a 3.0. So the code that you would use is 52235. On the board, you're going to see kind of this same type scenario, but they're going to add over here the 52000, which is just a plano cystourethroscopy separate procedure. Remember, separate procedure, you should really stop and think before you go to use it. So they're going to put on the board, they're going to put a modifier on this 52,000 code and combine it with one of these other cystourethroscopy codes. You cannot code them together. If you were to code the 52235 and the 52000 together, you would be asking the insurance company to pay for 2 cystourethroscopies, one with the bladder tumor removal and one just by itself. Well, you know there weren't 2 done. So this is a prime example of where that separate procedure becomes so important. Starting with code 52270, I have gone in and underlined my urethra or urethral. These are all on your urethra, male or female. Then if you turn the page, starting with 52290, they're ureteral. Okay, so I have had to go in and kind of mark what's my urethra and what's my ureter, just so I don't get them in the flurry of, oh my gosh, I got to find this code, or heck, I'm having such a hard time. It will at least tell my brain, look, you better stop and think about this because you may screw this up. Okay, on code 52310 and 52318, you may need to use modifier 58, so I've just kind of written myself a note. Here is some guidelines: insertion and removal of temporary ureteral catheter during diagnostic or therapeutic cystourethroscopy with ureteroscopy and or piloscopy is included in these codes, and you don't code it separately. This is back to the separate procedure unbundling stuff. This is another example of it. So you might want to study all of these codes and make yourself some notes. Starting with code 52320, all of these codes are going to include a temporary stent insertion and removal. They include the temporary stent insertion and removal. Okay, then moving over to code 52601. Did we change? Well, we kind of changed body parts, but it's not in red. This is the vesicle neck and the prostate. So this is just for males. Males have prostates, females don't. 52601, transurethral electrosurgical resection of the prostate. This is a TURP, transurethral resection of the prostate. TURP, transurethral resection, which means excision, of the prostate. The electrosurgical here that you see in this code, when you read your op report, it may be talking about a rectoscope. A rectoscope. These are transurethral approach, so they're going up through the urethra. If you have a different approach, then it tells you where you may want to go for that. Code 52630 is also a TURP, but it's specific to residual or regrowth. That means they've already taken out part or all of the prostate and it's come back, it's grown back. 52647 is a laser coagulation. 52648 is a laser vaporization. These are destruction codes of the prostate. Okay, some good pictures too, prostate. Okay, now the urethra, male or female. So this is incision codes, excision codes, which are open, repair codes, which are open. When you look at code 53440 and 53442, these are specific to males. So anytime you see a male code or a female code, I would be underlining it so you don't get them mixed up. Under manipulation, you've got urethral codes. Some are males, some are females. And that is it for this.